They found Don Ashworth's body in the woods just off 10-Pound Lane, a picturesque footpath that led from the village of Narborough to her home in Enderby. The newspapers recorded that the 15-year-old had been brutally beaten before she was raped and then strangled to death. "Killer in your midst," the Leicester Mercury screamed. "It could be your daughter next." That was true. That year, 1986, police had registered a record 2,228 cases of rape and another 661 of murder. Only about a fifth of the cases involving sexual perpetrators would be detected. Local police in this case, though, did act. They arrested Richard Buckland, a teenage boy who admitted in custody to committing the crime under intense interrogation. Later, though, Buckland declined to confess when he was produced in court. The police were convinced he was lying, but how to prove it? 5 miles or so from where Down's body was found at the University of Leicester, the geneticist Alex Jeffrey had been conducting experiments into the ways inherited diseases were transmitted. 2 years before the murder, Jeffries had extracted DNA from cells and then put them on a film and soaked the film in a bath of developer. What he got was a film plate with a long bar of cells, each bar pattern unique to an individual. The work had been seized on by authorities in cases involving children seeking United Kingdom citizenship whose parentage was in dispute. Few, however, took Jeffries seriously when he speculated his new technique might also be useful in identifying criminals. Some during that lecture laughed. Leicester's police force, though, asked Jeffries if his technique could help identify Dawn's killer. The scientists conducted tests on blood and semen recovered from her body, as well as from another girl, Linda Mann, who had been killed and raped at the same location 2 years earlier. The test showed both girls had been murdered by the same man, but they also showed the suspect in prison was innocent. Hi, and thank you for joining this week's episode of The Print Explorer with me, Praveen Swami. I'm recording this program in a week when outrage over the rape murder of a trainee doctor in Kolkata is sweeping across India. I've been considering the dangers of letting emotions instead of science guide our judgments. Among other things, I've written about the case of Komal Lodha, a teenager from Rajasthan who is serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of a 7-year-old child, even though DNA tests showed conclusively that he wasn't among the two men whose semen was found on her body. I'll leave a link to that story in the description if you're interested in knowing more about it. This episode of Explorer, though, isn't about the Lodha case. I want to instead unpack the incredible story of how forensic DNA techniques transformed criminal investigation after its first use in the Dan Ashworth case. The impact was particularly enormous in cases of sexual assault, where DNA helped cut through the lies and alibis perpetrators had used for centuries to discredit the testimony of their victims. Among other things, this mind-blowing story involves a woman you've probably never heard of, but in my opinion should have got a Nobel Peace Prize for her services to victims of sexual violence globally. Following Jeffrey's tests, police in Leicester sent out letters to every male born between 1953 and 1970 who had lived or worked in the Narborough area in recent years, asking them to agree to give a blood sample for DNA testing. Thousands were tested, some voluntarily, and others not so voluntarily but pressured by the society. 8 months saw 5,511 men give blood samples, but there was no match. Then a man was overheard in a pub saying he'd given a sample on behalf of Colin Pitchfork, a 27-year-old baker and father of 2 young children. Why Dan Ashworth, a detective, would later ask Pitchfork after he was arrested and a fresh test confirmed his guilt. He's said to have shrugged and replied, "Opportunity. She was there and I was there." Early in the 19th century, the scholar Ian Burney writes, the crime scene first began to be recognized as a distinct space which contained important clues about what might have happened and who might have done it. The first push, he observes, came not from police investigators, but from doctors who'd long been carrying out medical exams. Even though medical examiners were taught to be cautious in their approach, they were bumping up against all sorts of interesting facts. An 1844 manual prepared by King's College professor of forensic medicine William Guy reminded doctors their expert skills were confined to the corpse, not its settings and circumstances, but obviously doctors saw things and recorded them. The first practical guide to investigating a crime scene was written by the Austrian jurist Hans Gross in 1893 and translated into English in 1906. For Gross, the microscope was a critical investigative weapon which could be used to examine hair, fibers, blood, and dust. Gross described dust as our environment or surroundings in miniature. For example, he noted an investigator could identify sand from the desert, or fibers from the clothes of a dancer in a ballroom, or pulverized metal from a blacksmith's foundry. Edmond Locard, the French criminologist who founded Europe's first police science laboratory in 1910, took this work even further, introducing the use of photographs to fix investigative forensic evidence and create tools like custom-made vacuum cleaners. Locard noted that the sole of a shoe might, for example, hold layers of clues, like a layer of flour dust between two of earth, offering evidence that its owner had at one stage walked into a flour mill. Technologies to help solve crimes emerged constantly through the 19th century. For decades, historian Violeta Fuentes records, royal courts in Asia had used fingerprints as a means of establishing unique authorship. Europeans began to recognize fingerprint patterns in the 18th century, and the British colonial bureaucrat William Hirsch introduced them to Hooghly as a tool to reduce document fraud in 1858. Azizul Haq and Hemchandra Bose, both inspectors working for the Bengal police, played a critical role in organizing fingerprint archives, enabling matching of one to the other, and also to telegraphically transmitting the results. Developments work for which they were denied full credit, historians G.S. Sodhi and Jaspreet Kaur note. For centuries, Western jurisprudence, codified in the work of the legal scholar Matthew Hale, had stacked a huge burden of evidence against women who brought rape allegations to trial, arguing that with no evidence, they were just often inventing allegations to conceal their shame over what was really consensual sex. In the early days of forensic science, rape exams sought primarily to test the virtue of women. A doctor would be called to examine the woman's vagina and then report on her motives. Were there injuries that suggested she was really telling the truth? Evidence of resistance, or what a male doctor thought was adequate resistance, was critical. In one 1868 trial in the UK, for example, a surgeon, I quote, gave such evidence as left no doubt that the prosecutrix could not have been so innocent as she had represented herself to be. The magistrate, I quote again, said no jury would convict on such evidence and he should discharge the prisoner. So basically, women were expected to show evidence of massive resistance without which the case fell. The discovery by Jeffrey and the hunting down of Don Ashford's murderer offered for the first time the technological tools needed to radically change the balance of power in the courtroom. Women and men can lie, DNA can't. But how to get that DNA into the courts? Ever since 1972, when she first began working as a volunteer at a helpline in Chicago, Martha Halstead had been fighting on the front lines of America's secret war of sexual violence. She worked with depressed, drugged out, and hopeless young women who'd run away from home, sometimes called rebels, misfits. Martha realized they were actually often running away from rape and incest. The author Pagan Kennedy's superb biography of Halstead notes she recruited science as an ally in the growing feminist campaign to treat sexual assault as a crime that could be investigated rather than as a delusion women were making up. At the time, Kennedy writes, I quote, the cops didn't seem to care. The cops might dump a shivering, weeping woman in the emergency room and yell out, we've got a rape for you. As they cared for the victim, the nurses might wash her off or throw away her bloody dress, inadvertently destroying evidence. And worst of all, Chicago police training manuals, here's one from 73, declared, I quote, many rape complaints are not legitimate, and added, again I quote, it is unfortunate that many women will claim they have been raped in order to get revenge against an unfaithful lover or boyfriend with a roving eye. That's how things were not very long ago. Long before DNA's use would become known, though, Halstead began working with Chicago police officer Louis Vituillo to create a basic $2.50 kit which would allow nurses and doctors with no forensic training to gather blood, semen, and hair samples that could later be analyzed at laboratories. The scholars Misty Jeter and Jennifer Schmitz have noted that Vituillo ended up getting exclusive credit for the kits, which should tell us something about patriarchy, though it was Halstead who conceived of the idea and eventually gathered the funding that brought these rape kits widespread acceptance. The funding, ironically enough, came from a foundation run by the pornographic magazine Playboy. Through her advocacy and persistence, Halstead ended up ensuring sound evidentiary foundations for rape trials for the first time in history. The first conviction she secured was of William Johnson, who was given 60 years in prison for the kidnapping and rape of a Chicago bus driver from whose body evidence had been gathered using the kit. Forensic testing, of course, in the years since has cut the other way too. That very first rape conviction back in 1986 established, if you'll remember, that a man was innocent. There have been hundreds of cases since in which people put in prison, sometimes for jail or sometimes even awaiting execution, have been exonerated by DNA. The technology has also taught us that eyewitness testimony, even that of a victim with no reason to lie, is deeply fallible because of the nature of the human mind. The novelist Alice Sebold, with a little help from junk forensic science, ended up identifying her alleged rapist and putting him in jail for 16 years. It later emerged he was innocent. 5 boys alleged to have gang raped a jogger in New York Central Park, a scandalous case which sparked off former President Donald Trump's career, even confessed to their horrible crime, but DNA later proved they had nothing to do with it. From the 1970s, beginning with the work of psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, it became clear that human memory is very malleable, it's very plastic. In other words, that witnesses' memory of events could become altered over time even though they believed themselves to be telling the truth. In 1985, the psychologists Norman Bergman and Hunter McAllister showed how easy it was to change an eyewitness's memory of events using simple techniques of misinformation and pressure. These are techniques that police officers across the world, sadly, are familiar with and have proven very regrettably that they're willing to use unscrupulously in high-profile cases. So even though forensic science should be a win-win, both for victims and for the wrongly accused, it continues to be dogged by problems even in sophisticated police systems. For one, testing is expensive. The high costs, which can run up to $1,500 per test, as well as limited laboratory resources, means even the United States has run up a backlog of between 300,000 and 400,000 untested kits. Though some states in the United States have made determined efforts to clear the backlog, an effort that, by the way, has led to the convictions of dozens of serial rapists in decades-old cases, others lag behind. The situation in India, unsurprisingly given the size of our police budgets, is very grim. 12 years after the rape murder of a physiotherapist in New Delhi catalyzed massive protests across the country, it is clear the criminal justice system remains depressingly under-resourced. Ludhiana hospitals, recent media reports show, have been found to lack these simple, cheap evidence collection kits. In many other places where there are kits, people haven't been trained in using them. Hundreds of trials are held up in Haryana because there are no DNA testing facilities available to put those kits into. Local police have often sent samples to laboratories 10 days or more after their collection, sometimes rendering them completely useless. Forensic laboratories, moreover, if the tests do get there, are hopelessly backed up, to the growing frustration of judges who even tried fines and lectures to get things moving. But there just isn't the capacity. Even though the new Bharatiya Sanhita calls for greater investment in forensic detection of serious crime, there's no clear picture of where the funding for all this will come from, especially since state police budgets have been pretty much static for decades. The problem won't end by just creating labs, moreover. There just isn't enough staff to fill up the new laboratories that are being created. And much of the work is being contracted out to thinly regulated private sector facilities. And why that's a problem, you'll just see. Even the most advanced forensic techniques, moreover, aren't a magic bullet. Like other kinds of criminals, rapists have become increasingly adept at not leaving behind forensic evidence. Fabricating an alibi just needs friends willing to lie on your behalf and say you weren't there. And even where semen or blood is available, moreover, it doesn't necessarily address the question of whether a woman at some point consented to sex or not. And then there's the biggest problem of all, the state of science itself. Early in 2004, jihadists set off bombs on several commuter trains in Madrid, killing some 200 people, one of the worst terrorist crimes committed after 9/11. The country's police recovered fingerprints from a bag of detonators, which was to become central to the investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's automated fingerprint system, one world's most sophisticated, immediately identified one of the fingerprints as belonging to Brendan Mayfield. Mayfield was a convert to Islam who worked as a lawyer in the United States, often defending terror suspects. He was arrested and held in prison. The problem an internal investigation by the United States Justice Department would later concede was that Mayfield could prove he had not traveled outside the continental United States in over a decade. He had simply not been in Spain. The fingerprint Spanish police meanwhile found belonged to an Algerian jihadist, Uhan Daoud. They were very confident they had their man. Was this a simple mistake? How could it happen? Legal scholar Jessica Gable has noted that several well-accepted forensic techniques, ranging from fingerprints to blood splatter analysis to bite mark patterns and microscopic examination of fiber like hair, are deeply subjective. They rely on the person carrying out the test. The science behind the techniques has never been subjected to the scientific gold standard of double-blind scrutiny. In many jurisdictions, the reliability of examiners and their work is not even subjected to period re-evaluation and recertification. Careless work at the FBI's state-of-the-art labs, it was revealed in 2012, sent hundreds of possibly innocent people to prison. Law scholar Paul Gianelli noted that techniques used to determine arson cases were little more than, he writes, folklore handed down from generation to generation, pretending to be science. That junk science, however, led to the execution of Cameron Todd Willingham in 2009 on charges of starting a blaze which led to the death of his own children. Too many mistakes of this kind have taken place for students of criminology not to be skeptical about the state of the forensic evidence that is brought into our courts. German authority determined in one of the funnier cases that a woman killer was responsible for over 40 crimes, including the infamous homicide of a policewoman in the southern German town of Heilbronn, and another murder dating back to 1983. Later, however, it turned out that the swabs the police were using were accidentally contaminated with the DNA of a worker at the manufacturing plant in Australia. This phantom criminal the police was looking for didn't exist at all. In 2009, the United States National Academy of the Sciences, the country's premier science institution, slammed the state of forensics. I quote, with the exception of nuclear DNA analysis, it says, no forensic method has been rigorously shown to have the capacity to consistently and with a high degree of certainty demonstrate a connection between evidence and a specific individual or source. Strong words, but then the even stronger ones. The reality is that the interpretation of forensic evidence is not always based on scientific studies to determine its validity. This is a serious problem. That's the National Academy of Science, not me. This indictment, though, hasn't ended the widespread use of techniques like bite mark analysis and hair fiber analysis in either India or the United States. You'll find them littered around criminal trials. The legal system, sadly, is often ill equipped to adjudicate the complex science and evaluation behind this forensic evidence and reduces itself to trying to balance conflicting claims by experts. Poor criminal defendants, sadly, often have no recourse at all to independent expertise, so whatever the prosecution says pretty much gets to go. For both forensic science and its many failures, though, the solution is the same: more investment and higher standards. For all the talk, those are elusive in India. What we do know is that screaming lynch the killer or wanting someone castrated isn't necessary. We have the science and the tools to hunt down perpetrators if only we're willing to put the money and the effort into building a modern scientific criminal justice system. I'm Praveen Swami. Thank you for joining this week's episode of The Print Explorer.